We're going to do a review of two things today. First, we're going to talk about moral reasoning, thinking logically, and in particular, the last item on this list, because we've been through all this stuff, but we will revisit actually the second topic. But first, we're going to talk about reconstructing arguments. Then we're going to talk a little bit, just review, and you've been through that in detail. Then we're going to go through moral theories just to as a lead-in to start our discussion about sexual harassment. Now we know what the story is in the trolley example. The facts up here: trolley traveling down the tracks at 60 miles an hour, brakes fail, straight ahead, 5 people who can't get out of the way. Trolley driver can turn the trolley to another track, but there's one person on the track. There are no other possibilities. The question is, what do we do? And we didn't kind of come to a final agreement, because the first thing I suggested is a way to find out is we'll see what the two sides have to say about it, and we will reconstruct their arguments and then decide if the arguments are good. So here's what we did with regard to that. We had one group that was a majority opinion, said the right thing to do was to turn the trolley. It's right to sacrifice one person to save 5 people. Okay, and there was a minority opinion that it's not the right thing to do to turn the trolley, and the reason being it's not right to take the life of an innocent person. Then we had the assignment to reconstruct the arguments. And is it right to turn the trolley? We took the position, we looked at the majority position, which said yes. And based on their position, we said their conclusion was the right thing to do was to turn the trolley. And the premises that lead up to it, there was a moral premise. That is, if we can save 5 people by killing one, then the right thing to do is kill one. And the other premise, the first one was a moral premise. The second one was turning the trolley would save 5 people by killing one. Okay, so we saw that was a good way to reconstruct it. And then we looked at it. The argument was valid. But what we were worried about is, why should we think that first premise is true? And it was especially odd in light of the fact that when we went to the second trolley example, the fat man example, it turns out that if we use that very same moral principle, in fact, people said it's right to push the fat man. Let me just flip forward to that one. Is it right to throw the fat man off the bridge? Yes, which was the minority opinion in that example, but it says, and the argument was the right thing to do is throw the fat man off the bridge. First premise, the moral premise, is exactly the same. If we can save 5 people by killing one, then the right thing to do is to kill one. That is, it's the very same one that was the majority opinion in the first case that supported. It was a moral principle supporting the majority opinion. The second one is just a factual premise, just based on the way we set up the example. So we're kind of scratching our heads because the logic in both cases is good. Remember, the logic is the connection between the premises and the conclusion. Perfect connection. If those premises are true, the conclusion has to be true in both of these arguments. But what's funny is the majority of people in the first argument thought that was a good premise. If you can save 5 people by killing one, then the right thing to do is to kill one. And we got to this example, and most people said, gee, that isn't the right thing to do. Now we could go through the minority opinion, in the trolley example, which was, and I'll go back one because I think that's the last argument. Okay, is it right to turn the trolley? No, it's wrong to kill one person, even if it saves 5 people. Turning the trolley would save 5 people. Therefore, the right thing to do is not to turn the trolley. And the people in the majority discounted that first principle for the moral principle. I should have mentioned the logic is what we say impeccable, perfect logic. The connection between the premise and the conclusion. The second one is just stating a fact about we set up the case, but notice the majority was not swayed by this one. However, when we went to the trolley example, we just looked at that one. That is, that it's not right to throw the fat man off the bridge. And, we started, it's wrong to kill one person. That very same premise that we had in the first example. And throwing the fat man off the bridge would save 5 people by killing one. Okay. Therefore, the right thing to do is not to throw the fat man off the bridge. In other words, You should not throw the fat man off the bridge. You ought not. Okay, now, the problem is how do we defend these moral premises? What makes us think that some are okay and some aren't? And notice we were kind of inconsistent, or the majority of people were inconsistent. On the one hand, they thought that first moral principle, and it's wrong to kill one person even if it saves five, was right in this example, but wrong in the trolley example. So what I suggested is that maybe we ought to take a look at moral theories that philosophers have proposed to explain what makes an action right or wrong. And based on that, maybe we would have at least some evidence or some way of thinking about it. And it was worth at least delving into what the major moral theories are. And here I gave you kind of what you might call a taxonomy. If you don't know what a taxonomy is, it's just laying out the lay of the land for what I called act-based objectivist moral theories. Why is it act-based? Because in ethics, there are two kinds of things that we can evaluate from an ethical standpoint. One are actions, and you don't normally talk about things being right or wrong. The other thing being, sometimes it's outcomes, sometimes it's people, sometimes it's people's character. That is, it's not the action itself, but rather, is the person a good person or are they an evil person? Do they have good motives or do they have evil motives? Okay, but to take a look at these theories in general, first one we want to take a look at is one called utilitarianism. And this is a theory that supports that first premise in the trolley example that you should turn, supports the minority opinion. And what utilitarianism claims is that an action is right if and only if it has the best consequences for everybody. And it's the best consequence, I should mention, this theory is mostly associated, it was first stated more or less in this way by Jeremy Bentham. It's supported by John Stuart Mill. And in recent times, there's a philosopher who was at Princeton University and I think the Australian National University, an Australian guy, Peter Singer, who is a utilitarian who defends his position on, he's very famous for talking about animal rights. He defends his position on animal rights based on his defense of where he invokes the moral theory of utilitarianism, which, by the way, if you notice, it sometimes has the word consequentialism. That is, the best consequences. What best consequences? Well, usually it's a hedonistic version. That is, it's measured in terms of pleasure and pain of the consequences. So that's what makes something right or wrong. Now, that's a theory that's invoked to support the premise that it's right to sacrifice one to save everybody. That is, we have the least amount. If we're looking at pleasure minus the pain, if we can do a balance between the two, that the one that ends up with the best consequences for everybody in terms of pain or pleasure is, sacrifice one to save many. The idea is we don't know anything about the people, so if it's the guy on the one track versus the guy on the 5 tracks, turn the trolley away from the 5 because it's going to be a 5 times worse set of circumstances, consequences, than turning and having the other guy die. Now we have the other principle that we're talking about. I mean, this principle we all thought was right, or the majority at least thought was right in terms of for the trolley example. But when it came to the fat man example, pushing the fat man off the bridge, well, the tide just changed. And all of a sudden, the majority thought that's just not right. It's just not right to kill somebody, to save 5 people. And there's another kind of theory, what's called a deontological theory, deontology. And we sometimes say it's duty-based. That is, morality is, there are some moral duties that we have, and these moral duties can be expressed in terms of rules. And it claims that an action is right if and only if it conforms to the duties of the person acting. And Immanuel Kant is a early modern philosopher, Prussian philosopher, German philosopher, known for defending this kind of theory. And his view was, you should be turning the trolley, but it says, look, when you get to the fat man example, it looks like he's right. And it's just wrong. As a human being, you wouldn't want everybody else to kill you, to push you off the track. So why is it okay for you to push that guy off the track? It's questioning that. So the claim is that we have certain duties. One of those duties is not to kill an innocent person, a person that's not involved. So that's his theory. Now, obviously, one theory supports one moral premise, one theory supports the other one. Where do we end up? Well, you'll have to take Philosophy 7400 with me as I go through a detailed analysis of both of these kinds of theories to figure out the pluses and the minuses. And this is a matter of controversy, which kind of theory is right, or are both of them wrong? Is there something else that's, better? And maybe there is. But those are two kinds of theories. Just to mention a few other theories, just so that you're familiar with them, there's something called the divine command theory, which religious people usually invoke. That is, an act is right if and only if God commands the action. Should say command, it should say commands. God commands the action. Yeah, and people who are religious oftentimes religion invokes God's commandment, the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, to support the position that Kant takes in this one. And as I mentioned, when we first talked about this, is the problem with this one is who's God and who's he commanding, and how do you know what his commands are? While a lot of people who are certainly religious believers and believe in a particular religion, and oftentimes religions have associated with them a set of ethical values that come from God's commandment, like the Ten Commandments. So many people hold this theory, but obviously, again, another moral theory, another controversial theory. Then something that might have come out of the divine command theory is something called natural rights theory. That is, an action's right if and only if it does not violate anyone's natural rights. John Locke is the one known for this. And in fact, if you think about our Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and that all men are created equal, ... and they're endowed with certain natural rights. Where do they come from? The rights come from God, so it's sort of derivative. At least Locke's version was derivative of the divine command theory, but other people viewed it and said, wait a second, forget about God, let's leave him out of the picture. It's pretty clear if we look at human beings, that based on what kind of beings they are, there are certain things that it's okay to do with them and certain things not, and these are captured in terms of their rights, whether we have rules or not. It could be derivative of deontology. So now it's a little bit controversial, but certainly these kinds of moral reasons are invoked in a lot of ethical decisions and discussions, and it might be invoked to support the premises of not pushing the fat man off the bridge. He has a right to life. Okay, now let's take a look. Now those were objectivists, the main objectivist theories. I'll mention a couple a little bit later on, but they were objectivists because there was an objective criterion. That is, it didn't depend on what people believed. Now as we contrast those, and okay, over here I want to talk about ethical relativism, relativist theory. Well, we talk about criteria of morality, which I mentioned. The criteria is just a rule expressing what the moral theory says. It says an action is right if and only if, fill in the blank. And what we've heard now, God commands it. It has the best consequences, the best utility. That's where the name utilitarianism comes from, that. Or it satisfies the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is a less sophisticated version than Kant's version of deontology. We have a rule that defines what our natural rights are. Okay, and these are all objective theories, and the more general theory is it conforms to one's duty being more complicated than the golden rule. And all of these are versions of moral objectivism. That is, it doesn't depend on what people believe, whether the thing's right or wrong. Rather, it depends on whether God commands it. It depends on whether it has the best consequences. It depends if it's satisfying the golden rule. It depends if it conforms to someone's duties, and one's duties could be based on natural rights or some other formula. Okay, but those are moral objectivists. People looking at those, and since they could decide among them or thought, gee, it's not controversial, they say, oh, okay, well, morality, it just depends on what you think or what you feel is right. And a lot of people have very strong feelings. So it's what they feel is right. Oftentimes we hear this from, in a college classroom, many people outside of philosophy. Oh, well, you feel this you shouldn't be treating this way. Don't you feel that way? I don't know what happens if you don't feel that way. Well, they tell you you're a moral monster usually, but and they're not consistent in that. But that's a different story. But the idea is this is a subjective criteria. That is what makes something right or wrong. It's not something about the world out there, but rather what you think, and sometimes it's that it conforms to the moral beliefs, the general moral beliefs of the society and culture. And this kind of theory is known as moral relativism. Now, what I don't like about, and many other people don't like about moral relativism, basically it says, look, morality is just a matter of opinion, and everybody's got an opinion. If anybody who was in the army would have heard something about opinions like some part of your body, that everybody's got one. But it loses some of the value of morality. That is, why should anybody care? So that's your opinion. This is my opinion. Your group thinks that. My group doesn't think that. And sometimes people think that it leads to a form of moral skepticism, is that you can't know certain types of things. What kind of types? You can't know anything about morality. You're a moral skeptic, sometimes even a moral nihilist, even more as forget about it. Some people defend relatives say, forget about knowing anything. The reason you can't know anything is there's no truth of the matter. That it's all relative. Different people just have different views, which leaves you in an unhappy kind of situation in general that I mentioned. So the relativist theories that we have are what's one called cultural relativism, that is actions right or wrong if and only if it conforms to the standards or the moral standards of society. And we're just talking about problems. Well, some of the problems that come up if you buy this form of relativism, and it's very common today. In fact, it's probably the dominant view of you guys sitting out there in the classroom because you want to be tolerant. You think that this requires that you be tolerant. Well, first of all, you can't compare moral codes of societies at all. There is no basis because, hey, all you can say is that's the morals of that society, that's the morals of that society. You can't say, my God, look at those people, they're barbaric, they sacrifice their children, they kill their children. They put the kids out when they're first born, out in the mountain, if they're in the wilderness, if they survive 3 days, then they let the kid. People think that we can compare these moral theories. Even think about World War II, Nazi Germany versus the United States. Was the United States perfect? Of course it wasn't perfect. Were we superior to Nazi Germany where they round up a group of people, the Jews, based on their religion and made them a scapegoat? Well, I think people pretty much think we can compare those two moral codes and we can say, gee, in Nazi Germany, overall the moral code was not as good as the moral code in the United States. Sorry about that. Okay. And another one, if you don't like that example, think about the South and the North when we had slavery before 1865, before the Civil War. And people thought, if it's just the culture, down south the culture was, it's okay to own people. Up north, for the most part, although there had been slavery early on, at least in the 1860s, the North was against in general. And obviously it's not everybody, but the North was against slavery. You see, but you can compare. You compare a society with slavery, in the United States before, in 1860 and the United States in 1870, we can certainly say the moral code changed and it changed for the better. So you can compare it. Another strange thing about cultural relativism is if you want to figure out what's the right thing, you have a moral dilemma. Is it right for me to do X, Y, and Z? Is it right for me to cheat on exams? Is it right for me to steal some money? We figure that out by consulting the practices of our society. You take a poll. Now that should strike you, and that's what makes it true according to cultural relativism. That's a problem. In apartheid South Africa, you take a poll of the people who counted there. Okay, the people who counted, thought apartheid was okay. Discrimination against people of color was perfectly okay. And the other thing that we think that we've done, if we look at the civil rights movement, for example, we think that we've made moral progress, except cultural relativism, there is no such thing as moral progress, right? Because you can't compare the two moral codes. There is no it's just different. And finally, another thing, and these are, I think, four bad consequences of at least cultural relativism, is it looks like the social reformer is always doing wrong. Martin Luther King, the civil rights leader, what he was doing was he was doing things that went against the moral code in the places where he was doing things. The Freedom Riders, trying to end segregation. Well, segregation was the right thing to do down there at that point. So by definition, Martin Luther King was doing something wrong, at least by definition, according to the cultural relativists, and it seems to me that that just wasn't correct because, there are social reformers that are doing things for the better, and we do make moral progress, and we have gotten better. Sometimes we step back. It's questionable whether we're making, in certain regards, whether we're making moral progress or not. But in general, we at least think the concept of moral progress makes some sense. Okay, so that's cultural relativism for you. A couple of other theories just to mention that people have claimed. I should have mentioned the first one, especially in this class. An act is right if and only if it's in the person's best interest, the person doing it, which was proposed by Thomas Hobbes. He thought rights were derivative to to laws in the government. Ayn Rand is another one who defended this. She defended this more from the capitalistic perspective, and we might have put some other, maybe Adam Smith in there as defending. I don't know if Adam Smith would be there, but at least capitalists defending ethical egoism. It makes something right it's in my best interest, and people say, oh well, that's just because you said so doesn't make it right. It's as bad as the other relativist theories, except some people say, well, kind of what makes this balance out is we figure out, what's in if everybody does what's in their own interest, overall there are, and these are sometimes called invisible hand theory. With Adam Smith, it's called the invisible hand explanation. The invisible hand, overall, things are going to end up in the right way because people's interests will conflict and they'll resolve them, and everybody does what's best for them, and overall everybody's better. But that's ethical egoism. But the other issue is, if somebody's an ethical egoist, they say, gee, I like your property, whatever you have, your shoe, your sneakers, your shoes, your pocketbook, your phone. So I'm going to take it, because that's the right thing to do, because I like it, I need it. There's another view called contractarianism. Maybe it comes from Hobbes, his very famous contemporary philosopher, John Rawls, who defends this. That is, an action is right if and only if it conforms to the rules that everybody agrees to in the social contract. That is, there's a social contract. You might have heard that term, social contract, with regard to John Locke, with regard to Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France with the French Revolution. But the idea is that there is, and in a certain sense, contractarianism really hangs a little bit over the moral relativists, because some people claim that certain things do depend on the rules that everybody's agreed to. But contractarianism is that's all that makes something right or wrong. And even Thomas Hobbes' view is affiliated with this kind of view. Now, there are views that are based that worry about character, or let me say, agent-based morality. That is what makes something right is that the character of the person who's doing it. Very famous one, the action-based ethics, as we said, defines right action. Agent-based says what makes something right or wrong is whether the guy is a good guy who did it, whether it's a role model-based theory. Most famous one of this version of theories is virtue ethics, which is attributed, it goes back to Aristotle. That is, it stresses that what makes action right or wrong is it's because it comes out of the good person's good character. So a person has good character. What makes good character? They'll define what makes a good character, and Aristotle spends a lot of time on that. What are the good character traits? and then doing it on a regular basis. And if it comes out of this character, the action comes out of its character, it's a right action or wrong action. And a couple of other derivatives, feminist ethics, for example, there are theories that are known as feminist ethics that they stress the feminine virtues. Sometimes it's a version of that is the ethics of care. That is, the person who's caring has the right kind of character, and when they're doing things out of a sense of caring, they're doing the right thing. As I said, all these are they're not all. These are a lot of the basic moral theories, and there's a lot of controversy about them. And we could see, in fact, what you ought to do kind of as an exercise is sit down and think about the trolley examples and what do each of these moral theories tell you about what's the right thing to do in the trolley example. Okay, so that's where we were with regard to this particular, the trolley examples. Unfortunately, we didn't end in a great place, but we said, well, maybe if we looked at moral theories, we'd have an answer. But at least the one thing about moral theories, while each is controversial, we see that a lot of our moral reasoning is really based on the underlying idea or one of these ideas. Sometimes our thinking is utilitarian. Sometimes our thinking is deontological. That is, sometimes, when it comes to killing somebody, the deontological reasons are more important. That is, you just, have to treat everybody in the same way. They have the same rights and you have the same duties towards them. And sometimes, if it's a question of dividing up money, maybe, or some other resource, well, the utilitarianism, certain people are going to get shorted for the good of everybody else. The rich guy, we take away some of his wealth and we give it to somebody else because it helps society overall. But we got to think of these kinds of reasoning as we look, because remember, our course is a course in applied ethics. So now we're going to start looking in particular at particular kinds of actions. We had already started where we were looking at Gordon Gekko's question of, is greed good? And now we see there are multiple dimensions. That is acting a certain way that's termed greedy. Is the action right or wrong? And you guys have written about that. On the other hand, is greed itself, if we think about the definition of greed, well, we really don't think that's good. Okay, but that's to review where we are. Now, what we want to do is we're going to move into a couple of applied problems in the business context and see how our moral reasoning should work in there.